Content warning, discussions of pain and torture. Everything started while Marcus was preparing dinner. Carrying his plate over to the table where he usually had dinner alone, he saw a man in a suit sitting across from where he sat. Sighing to himself, he sat his plate down and began eating his fried rice. The man was clearly doing this to try and create an air of menace and setting himself up to be a powerful man by breaking into Marcus's house without warning and sitting at the table. That probably would have worked if this hadn't already been done a dozen times over by a dozen different people. By now, Marcus knew how to win this game. As long as he focused on his fried rice and didn't address the man at the table, the man would lose some of his air of menace. Sure enough, the man's smile already faltered as Marcus ate. In his own home, Marcus wore sweatpants and a loose tank top, not bothering to wear his binder or hair tie. The man wore a spotless red suit with a purple tie, a black top hat, and cufflinks made of human teeth with diamonds embedded in the teeth shaped like the Latin letter C. The man practically oozed that he was wealthy and used to controlling others. The cufflinks told a message that the man profited off of the suffering of others. The red of the suit was supposed to remind Marcus of blood, but also to show that he was a wealthy man by having a suit just for meeting someone in their own home. The purple tie was treason within the 7 cities. One had to be a part of the emperor's family to wear purple. Purple fabric wasn't even able to be bought, and art stores were suspiciously lacking of any paint, markers, pencils, dyes, or pens in the color purple. So he wanted to show himself as someone able to obtain illegal items just because he could, while also being able to wear it publicly. So the longer Marcus refused to address him, the funnier this was going to get. Now finished with his rice, Marcus stood up, grabbing his plate and turning off the dining room light, leaving the man alone in the dark as he took the plate to the kitchen to clean it. While cleaning the plate, he became aware of the man's presence behind him. Humming to himself, he finished washing his plate, drying it off, and putting it away. It took nearly 5 minutes for him to do it correctly before he turned around and saw the man standing in the hallway. The man was no longer smiling, and he was tapping his foot in impatience, holding a file in his hand. Now with Marcus facing him, the man was expecting Marcus to finally address him. Sadly, the man would have to be disappointed. Turning the kitchen light off, Marcus slipped past the man, refusing to let the man keep his dignity by being rude in someone else's house. Marcus marched down his hallway and made it to the living room, turning on his television and sinking into his old chair. Now the man stomped into the living room and stood in the corner, while Marcus started streaming a monster marathon. I wonder how long he's going to stand there before speaking up, Marcus thought to himself. Turns out the answer to that question was 3.5 hours. In the middle of a movie with a murderous lycanthrope, the man finally did speak up. Aren't you even going to say hello to me? He said, still standing in the same corner. That depends. Are you going to introduce yourself first? The man sighed before starting. Marcus Tun, Chief Investigator of the 5th chapter of the Hunters Guild of Vespucci. I am Pius Poplicola, plutocrat to the majestic master of Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage. I am here with a business proposition, Pius said, his pride in pain. What is your proposition? Marcus said, not looking up from the television screen. Pius sighed again before handing a file to Marcus. The front was marked as The Fortune Teller. While Marcus paused the stream to read over the file. Something he did appreciate about the plutocrats of Caligula's Carnival was that they liked to keep things organized for their own convenience, even though they treated the rest of the world like it ran for their convenience. The fortune teller was once a man, a long time ago, an augur who reads the futures through the entrails of animals, telling the future for a price. He served a powerful prince who paid him well for his services. One day, though, the Agar told of a prophecy to the prince that was so horrid that the prince gouged out his own eyes rather than see that future come to pass. He then ordered his guards to remove the Agar's tongue and to screw a metal helm to the Agar's head. The screws tightened into the Agar's bones. The Agar, now unable to eat, see, or hear, was left to wander the palace, his hands always reaching out to guide him through the palace. But still, this wasn't enough for the prince, who knew that the Agar was still free to roam the palace even without his senses. So he had the Agar thrown into the deepest dungeon in the palace. Down there, the Agar was supposed to die, but instead he lived and kept on living. Down there, despite having no tongue, he still told prophecies to anyone who would listen, snatching at the rats and tearing them asunder, his whispers driving his jailers mad with the visions of the future. And still the Agar would not die. Even when the prince's great-grandson had perished from old age, the Agar did not die, and the Agares did not stop. Even when the kingdom was long since dead, and the castle abandoned and overgrown, the Agar did not die, and his whispers did not stop. It was here, in the abandoned dungeon, that the Carnival found the Agar, who had changed immensely. The helm was now a part of his body, skin having grown over the rusty metal. The Agar's hands had grown eyes and mouths, allowing the Agar to see and to eat. But whatever was in the man's mind was long since gone. Other than to tell prophecies, the Agar did not speak. He only screeched like a hurt animal. Despite the best efforts of the Carnival, the helm could not be removed, but the Agar could still be used by the Carnival. Now called the Fortune Teller, the monster was chained to its booth in the second circle of the Carnival. Here, people could have their fortunes read, for a price. The Fortune Teller still needed entrails for the Agares. The patrons could have an idea of their future read if they brought an animal for the Fortune Teller to disembowel with his own hands. Here, the Fortune Teller would use his hands to see the future, examining the entrails by touch and with the sight of his hands. And when he saw what he needed to see, he would bring both of his blood-soaked hands gently to the patron's cheeks, cupping them. The mouths in both of his hands gently whispered the patron's prophecy into their ears. Some patrons would be driven mad by their future. Others were inspired, and others would leave without comment. But most became obsessed with the fortune teller's futures, offering more and more for the auguries. But since this is Caligula's Carnival, the price for better prophecies only rises. Most patrons who wanted to know their future in great detail needed to bring a sacrifice to the fortune teller, one of their own blood. Parents would bring their children to the fortune teller, watching the fortune teller disembowel their own flesh before the fortune teller's hands, coated in their own blood, cupped their faces and whispered of their entire future. Usually a terrible future caused by the death of their own child. Children would also bring their own parents to the fortune teller, willing to give up their bruises and broken bones to have their faces coated in blood one last time, to let go of their haunted past and to be whispered to how they can have the power to change their dark futures to a bright future. These patrons always leave with a smile. No matter how dark their future was, it was still brighter than their present. And it is the rare but most dangerous patron who would bring the one they loved to the fortune teller, someone close enough to be family and that they loved truly and deeply, and then sacrifice themselves to the fortune teller's auguries. Here, the fortune teller would tell their loved one not just of their future and how to change it, but how to control their own fate. These patrons, though so rare, are recognizable because the blood on their faces from the fortune teller's hands can never be washed away. The fortune teller had served Caligula's carnival for millennia by this point, but last night a child approached the fortune teller, and after receiving the prediction, broke the locks on the fortune teller's chains. Both the child and the fortune teller escaped from Caligula's carnival. When agents of the carnival tried seeking them both out, they only found the remains of the child hanging from the branches of a tree at the edge of the northern forest. So, now unsure how to track the fortune teller through the wilds of the northern forest, the carnival was seeking the help of the hunters. After all, the fortune teller can view the future anytime he examines a creature's entrails. According to legend, the Agark was not able to see his own future. Whether or not that was true of the fortune teller was unknown, but assumed to still be true. Now, the rest of the documents in the file are about details of the fortune teller's escape and present location that they were aware of. The fortune teller was believed to be in a canyon within the northern forest, about 100 kilometers northwest from the border of the Seven Cities. Even knowing this, it was well over 100 square kilometers that would have to be searched to find the fortune teller. They couldn't even get more precise because every clown tracker they sent into the canyon had never returned. So now the plutocrats of the carnival were asked to hire outside help. The final page of the file had a picture of the fortune teller, along with the reward money listed. The picture of the fortune teller showed metal plates screwed over where the eyes and the mouth were, leaving only a small slit for the nose so that he could breathe. But looking closer at the photo, Marcus could see that it wasn't a metal plate screwed into the skin. That was the exposed plates that broke out of the skin. The rest of the metal was underneath the skin, causing the skin to bulge and bruise in odd places. The fortune teller's hands were also visible. In the palms of each hand was a round, open mouth with visible, sharp, needle-like teeth in the palm of the fortune teller. No eye could be seen to Marcus, but the fortune teller likely had a way of sensing things with his hands. Still, even with no eyes, Marcus had a feeling that the fortune teller was staring down the photographer. The reward underneath the picture was a bit more interesting. 100,000 if dead, 250,000 if captured. Marcus sighed and closed the file. Pius was staring at him, smiling eagerly. "So, you think your team can try to capture the fortune teller?" Pius asked. Marcus pinched his nose as he asked his own question. "Let me guess, you want us to do everything we can to capture it, and if we don't succeed, you want us to bring proof of the fortune teller's death, probably by his severed head?" "Well, I was going to ask for his severed hands, but if all you can manage is a severed head, I'll accept it. And with all due respect, Mr. Poplicola, the amount feels a little low. We usually charge more than 100,000 centi for hunting a monster in the northern forest." Pius's smile vanished at those words as he processed Marcus's insult. "Do you think I'm a cheap man, M Tun? I don't deal with anything as cheap as centi. The reward is in auras. 200 million centi for the proof of the fortune teller's death. 500 million centi to bring the fortune teller back alive," Pius clarified. Marcus was no longer so bored anymore. "Well, I will need to talk to Michikotl and Sochi first, but I cannot see any reason why we cannot at least try to check it out. But we would need a non-refundable deposit made by check. I think 50,000 is a fair percentage, whether we kill it or capture it. Sure, I can write the check now. 50,000 centi, right? Pius said with a massive grin while his hand slipped into his jacket, withdrawing a checkbook and a golden fountain pen while he started writing on the paper. 50,000 auras. Now is not the time to be cheap, Marcus warned Pius. He knew Pius was probably joking, but he dealt with people from the esoteric community enough to know that if there was a loophole, they'd take it in a moment. Pius chuckled and tore away the check to hand it to Marcus, who read it over, and sure enough, it had the right amount of zeros. Lifting his eyes to look at Pius, he found that the man had vanished as mysteriously as he appeared. Dramatic as ever. Knock next time, Marcus called out loud before he took out his phone to start calling his cousin Michikotl about the new job. The next day, Maria was at Michikotl and Sochi's home explaining all the information about the case. Even though it was only 7 a.m. in the morning, both Sochi and Michikotl were already ready to leave, weapons packed, the van packed, and their clothes packed, while Maria was still in disarray and wearing the same clothes from last night when she spoke to Popsicola. So, that's the information we have on the case. I wanted to get you both to agree to it before we head out. Did his check clear already? Michikotl asked Maria, who nodded in return. Yeah, already cleared. Deposited last night and cleared before midnight. Checks that large usually take a few weeks to process and have to be approved by a few people, just to make sure there's nothing illegal going on. So, it seems Mr. Popsicola has quite a few friends in high places to rubber stamp it, but legally, we're clear, and the money is real, and I have no reason to think the rest of the money is fake. It is from Caligula's Carnival. The drawback is it's from Caligula's Carnival. Michikotl nodded, and Sochi looked like she bit into something sour. There was no surprise there. Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage was an even worse place than the name suggested. People very often entered the carnival and never left. Those lucky enough to leave usually had to pay an arm and a leg to just crawl away, but a very rare few left with a fortune and enough stories to keep people going in, even against impossible odds, hoping that they will be the next lucky one. It was like the state lottery, except all the losers were killed and robbed to fund the winnings. Even though it was dangerous, any attempts from any government to shut them down only led to the police finding an abandoned lot and a lot of skeletons. Some of the skeletons were still moving, still screaming, still killing. More than once, all three of them were called in to clear out the dead that wouldn't stay dead. So, naturally, no one in the room had a high opinion of Caligula's Carnival. But on the other plate of the scale, as dangerous as the carnival was, the plutocrats were known for being honest in their dealings, if not a bit mischievous when it was time to pay. And the reason why Pius was comfortable even approaching Maria the night before was because of a treaty made by the Hunters Guild in the old days. Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage would always ask the Hunters Guild for help in finding dangerous attractions that escaped. And in exchange, Caligula's Carnival would keep the dangerous creatures that the hunters could not kill as attractions. While there were also subtle details in the treaty, such as hunters could not harm a single representative of Caligula, and the carnival was not allowed to serve the hunters, an important part of the Treaty of Copper was that Caligula would seek out help from the Hunters Guild. So the plutocrat was likely to obey the treaty, simply because it benefited him more and cost him less to simply follow along. Do you think there's anything about this that feels weird? Sochi asked Maria. She thought for a moment and shook her head. No weirder than normal. The only thing I want to check when we get there is if the fortune teller is actually sapient or not. If he is, we need to try to get rid of his curse. Treaty or not, I don't want any cold blood on my hands," Maria said, lifting her hands up and looking at her fingers. They were clean and only lightly calloused. She had to do many things throughout her years to earn every single callus. But the work of keeping her hands clean was much harder than the work that made the calluses. "We'll keep ourselves clean, but I agree with this mission. What about you, Mitch?" Sochi asked her husband, who thought deep for a moment before he asked his next question. "Do you think the fortune teller can bleed?" he asked Maria. As ominous the question seemed, it did serve a tactical purpose. His weapons used obsidian bolts that were greatly enhanced in durability, with the ability to pierce even the toughest of flesh. But every bolt fired would have to draw blood, either his enemies or his own. Maria remembered not long ago how her cousin nearly bled to death when he missed his shot at a sufferer. "I believe he bleeds." The picture indicates that despite the metal helm, he's still mostly biological. Probably biologically immortal, but honestly, has that stopped you before? Maria asked, lightly slugging Michikoto's shoulder, who smiled in response. More than one creature had claimed to be immortal or unkillable or invulnerable, and all of them had bled by Michikoto's bolt. "Well, I guess that means I'm in also. Time to pack up the van," Michikoto said, which drew a long sigh from Maria. Despite everything in the van, there was still more to pack in, and packing up the van was always the least favorite part of any mission to her. It was boring, tedious, repetitive, and no matter what she did, she always forgot something that wasn't important while she was packing, but important during the mission. After a few hours, the van was fully packed up, and Maria went over the list of all the equipment. Weapons, rope, tents, knives, hatchets, solar charger, satellite smartphone, food, water, spare batteries, fire starter equipment, journals, and pens. She went over the list 3 times and even checked with Michikoto and Sochi. They couldn't find anything missing. So, finally ready, the 3 of them drove off to the northern forest. It would take a few hours to get to the destination, but Maria was confident they would make it to the northern forest with no issues, as she fell asleep in the back seat for a nap. The next time she woke up, the sun was starting to set, and Michikoto was shaking her shoulder, while Sochi was inside the gas station yelling at the cashier. "Hey, question. Where are the gas cans?" Michikoto asked while she yawned and stretched while going through her mental list. She didn't remember to pack the gas cans. "I think back home," she said, keeping her eyes closed in frustration. She heard Michikoto let out a long sigh before speaking. "Well, I wish I knew that 100 kilometers ago. This is the last gas station before we go to the valley, and there isn't enough room for the trip back in the van's tanks. I'll go ask if the cashier has any for sale." More screaming and yelling could be heard inside of the gas station, while Michikoto let out a sigh of a different tone. "Before Sochi blows the roof off the gas station," he said before leaving and heading into the gas station to calm Sochi down. Sochi was a good person. One of the kindest people Maria ever met. But she also had an unfortunate habit of absorbing emotions from those around her. This made her empathetic and a good diplomat, but sometimes it also led to situations like these where she escalated and just kept escalating until things became destructive. But fortunately, Michikoto could always calm her down. Maria watched as Michikoto spoke with the cashier while Sochi stomped out to the car and sat down, being completely silent, staring at the windshield. After leaving her alone for a minute, Maria reached up, So, you doing okay? Maria asked, reaching forward to grab Sochi's shoulder, who let out a sigh while staring out the windshield. No, the cashier was a jackhat. He was asleep when I went in, and when I tried buying the gas canister, he got upset for me for disturbing his nap. He actually started complaining about how he was bored all the time, and only when he was napping or watching a video did someone come in. Sochi's fingers were straight and held to the side of her head, while she pressed her hands against her head, trying to keep the frustration from overwhelming her. I tried to just listen and apologize. Normally I would have just left, but we need the gas canisters. And he just kept complaining. Even when I asked to just pay for the canister, he had the audacity to complain about how people don't like to listen. And the worst part wasn't even his words, but what was in his head. He actually believes that the world exists just to make him frustrated. He kept getting frustrated and kept going on and on and on, and then I just snapped. I told him to his face that if he wanted to get paid to sleep, he could try to get a job himself, instead of being given this job by his failed father. Needless to say, I am glad Michikoto stepped in. That cashier is beyond pissed. So she finished while Maria rubbed her shoulder for a moment before she asked, "Did he actually get this job because of his father?" "Well, yeah, his father owns the gas station. His name is on the licensing outside, and the cashier's name tag has the same last name but a different first name, and he was very embarrassed that I pointed it out to him, that you don't need to be an empath to notice that." Sochi finished before Maria giggled. "Glad you showed him, but I'm hoping we aren't banned for life." "Wow, a week-long ban, a brand new record." That comment brought a smile and laugh to the two women. They had dealt with life-ending dangers on a regular basis since they graduated college. Joking about death was part of their coping mechanisms. Michikoto was finally leaving the gas station carrying 2 red gas canisters while he got busy filling them up. "I'll check up on him," Maria said, leaving the back seat as she went out to speak to Michikoto, while Sochi started playing music on the radio to distract herself from what just happened. "So, how bad is the damage?" Maria asked him. "Well, the good news is I got 2 gas canisters, but they were like 40 each. So, that's a thing." "That's the good news. Do I even want to know what the bad news is?" "Well, Sochi has been banned from the only gas station in Craven's Creek." "I didn't know this white spot in the road was a town," Maria said, looking around the gas station. There was a 2-lane road, a single pump gas station with the general store inside, and across the street was a rundown shack that looked like it was condemned when the emperor's grandfather was born. The only other thing around was the towering trees that thrived in the northern forest. She was no stranger to small towns across Vespucci. She had even visited more than one town that had a population of 0, and even towns that had -0 people, but they were still better maintained than Craven's Creek of the northern forest. "Welcome to Craven's Creek. Our amenities include tax-free gasoline and firewood," Michikoto said sarcastically while filling up the canister, bringing a chuckle from Maria. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked, patting Michikoto's back. This was the first mission he took since getting injured on the Nagelfari, and there was a lot of money in that mission, but most of it was spent just getting Michikoto patched up and back to fighting shape. Being a hunter and a hero was a costly business. Most families who lost their heirlooms to a hellhound generally didn't have a lot of money to spend on getting it back, so rare missions like these that paid so well were worth it. But the risk was also great. The loss of Michikoto was something she didn't want to think about, but that was a very real possibility ever since he started the hunt. "I'm doing okay. The cashier was a jackhat, but we've handled jackhats before." "You know that's not what I'm talking about." "Oh, Yeah, I'll be okay. I've healed well, and quite honestly, I need a win. On the Naglfar, there was almost no one left, just so much death. And I was almost just another bloodstain on that boat, Michikoto said before he held his hand to his heart for a moment, like he was reassuring himself that his heartbeat was still there. When I was bleeding out, my thoughts weren't about me. They were about Sochi, about how I was never going to see her again. And I could swear that I heard the laugh of Kaisen when I was in her arms. I sent so many to him, it's only a matter of time before he claims me also, Michikoto said while Maria awkwardly switched from one foot to the other. Have you talked to Sochi about these dreams? She knows about them. That doesn't answer my question. You should probably talk about the dreams you're having with her, and you know we can get you a therapist to talk about with these dreams also. Lots of people struggle with survivor's guilt and have had a hard time sleeping after a near-death experience, Maria offered, while Michikoto sighed, being quiet for a moment before he finally answered. Okay, I'll talk to a therapist when we get back. But you're still keeping my secret? He asked, and Maria nodded. Of course, cousin. I've not told a single soul, she reassured him. Michikoto didn't keep many secrets from Sochi, but this was one he shared with his only cousin. His weapon wasn't just enchanted to draw blood with every shot. Michikoto believed that his bolts were enchanted by Kaisen, god of death and the underworld, and that Michikoto's life will only end by his own weapon. This made him brave in many situations, but also made him incredibly anxious every time he was injured by his crossbow. Maria asked him many times to at least use non-enchanted obsidian bolts, but he insisted on using them for every hunt. He refused telling Sochi because he knew if she knew, she wouldn't let him use the crossbow anymore. And despite his beliefs, Maria didn't believe his bolts were enchanted by Kaisen. She didn't believe in any god. She believed that the world was strange, complicated, and fantastical, but that it had to have some kind of rules to be followed by every being, powerful and powerless. But she still respected her cousin's belief and spirituality, and as ridiculous the explanation for why his crossbow was so powerful, she knew for certain many supposedly deathless demons had died by that crossbow. The canisters, now filled with gasoline, Maria grabbed them ready to put them in the trunk, but before she did, she whispered to Michikoto, "You're going to have to tell her about your nightmares. You don't have to carry the burden alone, but if you keep holding that by yourself, we will be carrying you, not your burdens. Remember that," Maria warned Michikoto. After the gas was in the trunk, Maria slipped back into her seat, while Michikoto continued his driving. As she started dozing off, she heard Michikoto whisper to Sochi, "I need to tell you about my nightmares." When they arrived at the valley, the sun had already set hours ago. Maria woke up when Michikoto put the van in park. He locked the doors and whispered to Maria, "We can't go out at night. The fortune teller might not be nocturnal, but we're not nocturnal either. So Maria, think you can keep watch till sunrise?" Yeah, but are you going to be able to sleep?" Maria asked while Michikoto yawned and unbuckled his seatbelt while he leaned his seat back. "I'm sure I'll manage," he said, closing his eyes and starting to slip off to sleep. Sochi was already asleep next to him. Maria sighed and watched the outside for any movement. This did work out better for her. She was more awake at night than in day, and she did get a chance to sleep on the ride over. She was always like this, but very few jobs or classes thrived on someone more awake at night than during the day. But thankfully, Michikoto was accepting of her sleeping during the day. Feeling a shift, Marcus reached into his pocket for his rubber band and tied his long hair behind his head into a ponytail. He wished he had more space to change his clothes and to get to wear his binder, but he would still make do. This was another perk of working with his family. They were accepting of Marcus when he was a he, or when Maria was a she. Being gender fluid was a lot of things, but he found that he didn't have to explain himself to the world if he didn't want to. So he just did what made himself the most comfortable. Watching the woods through the windows, Marcus saw some of the bushes moving with the wind, but his paranoid eyes saw it as a threat. Letting himself stare for a moment, and not seeing any changes, he let his eyes relax and simply watched the woods and listened. It was a lot like growing up, constantly watching for threats and often over-examining the simplest of things. Sometimes when people were coughing, they were trying to insult you. Sometimes they were preparing to attack you, and sometimes it was just a cough. Sometimes bushes moved because of wild animals adjusting for the night. Sometimes bushes moved because of the weather, and sometimes bushes moved because something was in them trying to hunt you. Still though, Marcus let his heart relax, seeing no other evidence of danger. He let his anxiety chill and cool. His friends were counting on him to watch over them, and they would need rest, so he would only wake them if he was certain. And so the night went on. Marcus watched and listened, and though he was certain he heard rustles, they didn't last long enough to pinpoint, let alone identify. He heard the calls of birds and the buzz of bugs, and the rustle of the wind through the leaves. So he was certain whatever it was normal. But as the first light of a gray dawn made itself known through the windshield, something happened that caused Marcus's hair on the back of his neck to rise. At first, he swept his eyes over the forest to see if it was something he saw. He was aware of it unconsciously before his conscious mind made the connection. The forest was now quiet. Throughout the entire night, the forest wasn't truly quiet, not even in the van. He could hear the sound of small animals moving and movement in the woods, and of the breeze through the trees. But now, all of a sudden, there was nothing. No birds, no bugs, no breeze, nothing. Very few predators have the power to inspire such fear among the entire animal kingdom, and none have the power to quiet the wind. Shaking both Sochi and Michikoto's shoulders, Marcus whispered to them both. "I think there's something outside," he whispered while they woke up, quickly but quietly. Thankfully, they had an almost instinctive reaction to waking up, fully functional. "I'll go first," Michikoto whispered, picking up the large knife he kept in the driver's side door. Being a hunter and being paranoid, Michikoto had a weapon within reach in all parts of the car at all times. Marcus was aware of at least 4, but according to Sochi, she knew of a dozen more. When they asked Michikoto about how many weapons he had, he laughed and said they were thinking too small. Opening his door quickly and closing it, Michikoto stood outside. His knife was drawn and held professionally, with the practice of one who knew how to handle it. Despite the fear Marcus felt in his heart, Michikoto searched without fear. Whether that was from the belief that he wasn't going to die here, or just pure courage to face whatever was outside, Marcus was unsure. Michikoto disappeared to the side of the van, and there was silence before there was a long knock, followed by 2 quick knocks. Michikoto's sign that it was safe to come out. A signal that was worked out when both Marcus and Michikoto were children. Opening their doors, both Sochi and Marcus stepped out and saw what made the forest animals stop calling. In the clearing, not 20 meters from the van, were the remains of a bear, but it wasn't killed by any wolf nor bear that lived in these woods. No meat was taken from the bear, and the skin and the rib cage were broken apart, and the entrails were removed and left discarded on the ground. Handprints and footprints left in brown blood and dust were marked on the bear's skin and led to the woods. The corpse was starting to smell, and already Marcus was trying to figure out how to bring the corpse away from the camp. But then Marcus noticed something else that was wrong. Despite the fact it was starting to smell and was clearly dead for a while, not a single scavenger scurried through the savaged carcass. The flesh was either poisoned or cursed by the fortune teller's touch, and now no creature would touch the flesh. So clearly, neither should they. The fortune teller left us a message last night, Marcus said, opening the trunk and removing a canister of gas as he poured it on the bear carcass, making sure to leave it soaked so that it would catch easier. "What message is that?" Sochi asked, trying not to look at the corpse. Even with the bear gone, she was probably having intrusive thoughts about how it would feel to have gasoline on her internal organs. So looking at the bear definitely would have made things a lot worse for her. "The message is, I'm strong. This is my territory. Leave or you will die. This is your chance to leave." This implies sapience, or at least foresight, on the behalf of the fortune teller. That just made things a lot more complicated, Marcus said, removing a book of matches from his vest's many pockets. "With your blessing, Michikoto?" he asked his cousin. "Oh, sure. You can burn it," Michikoto responded before Marcus sighed and tried again. Say your prayers while I burn the cursed carcass," Marcus said. He didn't believe in the gods, but he did notice prayer did help keep cursed items from surviving the purifying effects of fire. "Oh, yeah, sure," Michikoto said as he began his prayer to his namesake, while Marcus struck a match and let it drop on the gasoline-soaked skin. It took 4 tries before it finally caught, and then they backed away from it, watching it burn and the black smoke twist and dissipate into the sky. As the cursed corpse carbonized, the cries and calls of the creatures of the forest started to return as it was turned to ash. Whatever the fortune teller had planned for that trap was now disrupted. At least, hopefully. Still, though, Marcus glanced around the trees, feeling that somewhere the fortune teller was watching, and he knew this wasn't going to be any normal hunt. After covering the ashes of the bear, everyone broke up into their roles. Sochi began by cutting firewood. She was careful to find trees that were either already dead or at least dying before cutting them with the axe, splitting logs with a single blow with her chipped grade 4 titanium axe. "Careful with that axe, they're expensive to replace," Marcus called out while he grabbed the cooking stove and all in the food, while Sochi waved back. Setting up the bear-proof food containers, he put the cold food in the cooler as Michikoto traveled to the woods, setting up the observation stations and traps. Cameras would have to be set up in the trees to see if anything might try to sneak into the camp, along with snares to try and catch the fortune teller. It was no guarantee that the traps, or even the cameras, would catch the fortune teller, but it made things just a bit safer knowing what was out there, rather than just wandering the woods with no guidance. As Marcus continued to stack the stones in the clearing to make a fire pit, he heard a loud clang and Sochi swearing when the clang was heard. "You hurt?" he called out, pausing his stone piling to glance over at Sochi. She dropped the axe on the ground, and both her pants and shoes had a long gash in them from where the axe cut through it when she missed the swing. "No, I'm fine. I just hit my foot by mistake, so now my clothes are all ruined. I think I might have chipped the axe again," Sochi said as she ran back to the van to grab a change of clothes while Marcus sighed. Damn it, not again. I'm glad you're not hurt, but grade 4 titanium is expensive, and a blacksmith who can work with it is even more expensive to pay for. But are you sure you're fine? Marcus asked as Sochi called back from the van. Yes, it didn't even break the skin, Sochi yelled back, while she searched through the crates for spare pants. Marcus turned back to the fire pit building, so it wouldn't let the fire spread while he got lost in his thoughts. Sochi was an exime, a person with extraordinary power. While Marcus wasn't sure of all of the details, he knew that Sochi had greatly enhanced strength, speed, and durability. And he watched her fly at least once, but she did not want to explain that one to Marcus at all. But that was why all the equipment they had to be so durable. So Sochi didn't accidentally take an axe and crumble it against a tree like an empty soda can. Marcus saw her do that more than once when they tried cheaper axes in the past. Now it was just cheaper to splurge on the most durable items that didn't break right away. While it may have seemed obvious to have an exime like her doing the fighting instead of a Tipicam like Michikoto, except that Sochi wasn't a fighter. She didn't enjoy fighting, and being a natural empath meant she could feel her opponent's pain just like her own, making it almost impossible for her to fight a monster, let alone kill it. But there were exceptions, such as on the Naglfari when she killed a sufferer who nearly killed Michikoto. She had nightmares for weeks afterwards, but she did it. Even so, both Michikoto and Marcus agreed she would not be asked to fight unless there was nothing else that could be done. The fire pit, now finished, Marcus placed some of the split logs into the fire pit, built almost as a triangle. Ready for the night, the fire pit now done, Marcus focused on the other necessary but less fun parts for camping out in the northern forest, such as digging a latrine far from the van and farther from the food. After a few hours, Michikoto came back with his map, marking the locations of the cameras and traps in the woods. Laying the map down on a freshly set up table, Michikoto, Marcus, and Sochi sat around it while looking over the grid of the valley. The van was near the entrance, and there were 3 red X's over a part of the northern valley. He's not there. I started searching there. No evidence of the fortune teller there. All the animals were behaving normally, but here, he points out a grid 3 squares away and circled in yellow. There were no animals, no breeze, and the smell of rot in the air, but no buzzards in the air. If I was to guess, there's either another augury there, if not the fortune teller himself. But I decided to come back so we could all take a look into it. Do you think it's a good idea? Michikoto asked. Marcus first turned to Michikoto, then Sochi, who then spoke up. It's a good place to start, better than traipsing through the woods. It would take us nearly 2 weeks to comb through these woods properly. If we start there, we may save some time, and if all else fails, I have a feeling we'll understand our foe just a bit better, Sochi said. And it was now Marcus's turn to speak. It feels like it may be a trap to me. We know the fortune teller is intelligent and has foresight, and Michikoto's path just happens across an area of the woods that has the fortune teller when there's acres of forest to hide in. Suspicious at best. Unfortunately, I cannot think of anything better to do. If we go in well armed and prepared, we may be able to defeat it. But even if it is a trap, we will learn a lot more about the fortune teller. Dealing with a fox or dealing with a wolf. He finished with a quote, while the other 2 nodded solemnly. The quote was about dealing with monsters. From a distance, a fox and a wolf may look very similar, but while one was clever and could outsmart a hunter, the other could hunt the hunter. The trouble, though, was it was impossible to tell which was which until they got close to it. Well, I'll grab my guns, Maria said, tying her hair behind her head while heading back to the van. When they left the campsite traveling north, they didn't couldn't speak at all, sticking to expressions and sign language to communicate with each other. Sochi had her knives for throwing, and Michikoto carried his crossbow, while Maria had her modified standard infantry rifle and her sidearms. At first, the woods were peaceful. Numerous bird calls could be heard, and if Maria observed the branches and bushes carefully, she could catch flashes of the beautiful birds. She could also see deer in the woods, who would watch the hunters with cautious eyes, unsure whether it was better to stay or run. As they traveled into the woods, Maria also saw evidence of the more esoteric residents. In between two branches, a single rose grew from a circle of mushrooms, a trap for anyone who wanted to collect the rose. The thief would prick their fingers on the thorns and then be dragged into the fairy circle, never to be seen again. Maria could also see just beyond the edge of the trees a stairway to nowhere, well maintained and out of place. Despite the different nature, it was for all intents and purposes a trap, just like the fairy circle. They knew better than to check it out. Only humans were dumb enough to be caught by the staircase, and Maria didn't want to be that dumb human. The strangest thing to be seen so far was the bleeding trees. Sochi grabbed a branch of a tree while bracing herself, and she snapped the branch off of the trunk. After seeing the color of the sap, she threw the branch and hissed. "Did it get on you?" Michikoto whispered. Sochi shook her hands, lifted them to her face before showing it to both Michikoto and Maria. Sure enough, no blood and no sap on her hands. Blood trees were exceedingly rare, but they did exist in the northern forest. The sap had the same consistency, color, smell, and taste as human blood, but it was highly poisonous and corrosive, and most people believed the sap to be cursed to anyone who touched it. Part of the reason why they were so rare was that blood tree seeds had to be planted within a human heart, and the roots would grow through the bones of the body buried to fertilize the tree. Maria examined the tree roots, and sure enough, peeking out from where the trunk met the roots was a human skull. It was very old, with soil within the sockets and small sprouts growing from the eyes, and the mandible was down, so the skull looked like it was still screaming. Even as Maria watched, some of the blood tree's sap leaked out from behind the skull, making it look like the skull was anointed in blood. "Keep moving," Maria signed to the rest of the group. She wanted to get away from that skull, and the tree was making her increasingly uncomfortable to be around. Even if she knew how to deal with blood trees, they were uncomfortable, and the branches above may just start leaking, or something else may occur. And as toxic as the sap was, there were still creatures that drew nutrition from it. Those same creatures could just as easily draw human blood to gain those same nutrients. While they continued to the territory where they thought the fortune teller was, silence shuddered through the shadows of the forest. The group crouched down and remained silent and still, waiting for either the danger to pass or for the attack to happen. Maria glanced through the trees, trying to find the fortune teller, letting her eyes adjust to the greenery, looking for any shapes that didn't belong, or for any motion. It was a skill that had to be worked on. People usually adjust to their own lives, but they wouldn't even notice when their path changed paths until they were tripping over it. But Maria had lots of practice trying to find things out of place. There, in the bushes about 5 meters away, something was moving and munching. Maria slowly signed to Michikoto and Sochi, who looked at the bushes. Michikoto then signed to Sochi. "Danger?" His pace indicated a question. While Maria stared at the bush for a moment, her expression confused while she brought 3 fingers together for both Maria and Michikoto to see. "No," she signed. She took a deep breath and stood up, approaching the bushes. Michikoto looked like he was about to reach out for her, but then he stopped. He trusted her. and as much as he wanted to keep her safe, odds are whatever it was couldn't hurt her anyways. More munching noises could be heard from the bush as Sochi pushed the leaves aside to reveal what was eating and making those munching noises. The first thing Maria noticed was the large brown eyes. They looked mournful and intelligent. The creature was covered in brown fur that covered its body, and its forelegs were covered in mud. It also had 2 tusks that looked far too large for its body, and it was only as tall as Sochi was. And the creature was chewing on the berries that fell to the ground by grabbing it with its trunk like a prehensile limb and chewing away at it. It wasn't the fortune teller, it was a young mammoth, a megafauna pachyderm that was considered extinct by the exoteric scientific community. But just 20 years ago, many megafauna that were thought to be extinct were found to still be living in the northern forest. So officially, the creatures like the one that Sochi was petting were a Lazarus taxon, a species that were once thought to be extinct but were discovered to still be living. "Where is the mother?" Michikoto asked, keeping his crossbow ready, and Maria was in agreement with him. Herd animals didn't leave their young alone for long, if at all. But that was a more pressing question. If this young mammoth was out all alone, where was the mother? Or the herd? "Dead," Sochi said in an almost trance-like state while she kept petting the young mammoth, who responded by wrapping its trunk around her other arm while she gently patted it on its forehead. Something killed the matriarch of the herd, tore it asunder. Her older sisters tried to help the matriarch, but they all got torn apart. Sochi's eyes were filled with tears, and so were the mammoth's. Maria was unsure if she was crying because of what happened to the mammoth, because the mammoth was crying, or if the mammoth was crying because Sochi was crying. The young ones all had to run. It kept tearing the herd apart. She doesn't know if anyone else survived, Sochi said as she kept petting it. Her tears continued to fall. Chikoto crouched down next to her and whispered something that Maria couldn't hear. After another moment, Sochi nodded and stopped petting the mammoth as they continued their trek to the location where they thought the fortune teller was waiting. After about half an hour, they made it to where Michikoto thought the fortune teller was hiding. This part of the valley was mostly open space with sparse trees, but Maria was certain there was something quite wrong with this part of the valley. In one of the trees, nearly 20 meters off of the ground, the entrails from the large animal were left dangling. The soil beneath the blood was left a sickly shade of brown, no grass growing where the blood dripped and dried. The tree itself was already dying where it was touched, and Maria silently swore to herself. The augury remains were indeed cursed, and the fortune teller was indeed leaving the remains out to spread corruption. Maria marked the location on her map. This area would have to be returned to destroy the corruption, or else it may spread and continue to kill, possibly leaving large parts of the northern forest uninhabitable. Something Maria wasn't going to let happen if she could help it. "I think he's deeper inside," Michikoto said, leading the group deeper into the sparse trees. His voice sounded wrong. There were no calls, no sound of wind, even though Maria could feel it, and his voice didn't echo. It passed once and then never again. Something about the fortune teller's presence, or possibly his curse, seemed to make it so ambient noise didn't exist. The how was a difficult question that Maria was not likely to figure out without some major investigation and equipment that she didn't include. But the why it happened was something she might be able to figure out. Something that could help her figure out a possible weakness of the fortune teller. Maybe it was vulnerable to sound, or it didn't enjoy it, or maybe the auguries themselves canceled it out. As they traveled closer, they made it to a circle of trees where the fortune teller definitely made its lair. The trees were all lined with entrails, and the ground was full of the rotting hides of various animals and piles of stones. While Maria couldn't recognize all of them, she did recognize mammoths, bear, wolf, and moose. The fortune teller didn't appear to discriminate, and sure enough, near the center of the layer laid a humanoid corpse. Even after death, the skin was still as pale as paper, the rib cage segmented and broken along the front. The heart was crushed and useless, but the lungs still gasped and moved as if it was still breathing. The entrails were dragged down and out of the corpse, and the most disturbing part was the face of the clown. The head was untouched. The clown's gray eyes stared up at the sky, its mouth still open in a wide, toothy grin, the still red veneer of its blood still on its teeth. The blood didn't coagulate like normal human blood. And then the most startling thing happened. The head laughed. It wasn't a loud cackle, but just a small enough laugh for Maria to know that something was still there. "The clown's still alive?" Michikoto asked incredulously. There was no heart, and it was left to rot among the cursed entrails, and still, the clown lived. The clowns of Caligula's Carnival are cursed to keep living until their contract is fulfilled. But yeah, Poplicola gave me the impression that whoever was sent to catch the fortune teller was killed. Maria responded, staring down at the clown's head, who stared back at her, which only seemed to make the clown head laugh just a bit louder. "I'm going to put it out of its misery," Michikoto said, lifting his crossbow and aiming it at the clown's head, which only brought a more demonic laugh from the clown's torn lips. Before Maria lifted her hand in response, indicating for him to put his crossbow down. Clowns don't bleed, and even if they did, part of the Treaty of Copper is we can't kill any employees of Caligula's Carnival who didn't run away, Maria warned him. Michikoto, reluctantly, put his crossbow away. "What do you recommend we do?" he asked Maria, who sighed and then shrugged. "I'm not sure. We should just leave the clown alone till after the hunt, and then Poplicola can take care of it." At the end of that sentence, the clown stopped laughing. "He approaches," Sochi said, pointing towards another path through the trees, different from the one that they took to get into the lair. "Hide," she said as she dived away, while Michikoto also rushed to find somewhere safe to hide. Maria looked around the clearing to try to find her place to hide. She noticed a pile of rocks forming a small cave that would serve as a place for her to hide for a while. Glancing into the hole and confirming it didn't hide any snakes, spiders, nor any cursed entrails, she slid into the hole and peeked out, her rifle at the ready. Sure enough, she couldn't see Michikoto nor Sochi, and there was no real way to communicate with them without alerting the fortune teller. Moments like these, everyone had to trust that they knew about the others, and also trust that they were thinking things thoroughly before any action was taken. Maria watched as she finally saw the fortune teller in the flesh for the first time. He was a lot smaller than she was imagining. In her mind, she imagined him as a towering individual. Instead, he was shorter than she was. He did still have the metal helm on his head. She could see scratch marks in the metal where he tried to peel it away, and at his neck she could see where the skin was starting to grow over the metal. It scabbed, and it was raw where the fortune teller was trying to peel his own skin away from the metal. And he also dragged behind him the body of a deer. The deer has clearly been dead for a short while, and unlike the other corpses, it still had flies around it. So whatever the curse was, it wasn't started by killing the creatures, but by something else. Maybe by the augury? Realizing something, Maria almost kicked herself. Of course, the fortune teller couldn't see. Hiding served very little, if any, purpose. Thinking her plan through, Maria crawled out of the hole and stood up straight, facing the fortune teller who was turned away from her. His hands plunged into the stomach of the deer, likely preparing to do his auguries. Maria shuddered her rifle, hoping it wasn't necessary, but she also knew that if she could fire upon the fortune teller in seconds. But she had to give him a chance. She had a lot of calluses and scars from her hands because of her choices, but she still kept them clean of blood, and she was going to keep it that way. "Fortune teller!" Maria yelled at him as he turned to face her. Even the front of the helm, where the face was supposed to be, was still just metal and torn skin. No eyes, no mouth, only a thin slit for his nose, so he could breathe. "Does the black moon howl?" she asked with a 5-word test to see how he responded, or even if he could respond. As a response, the fortune teller lifted his hands up to the skies, palms up, before turning his hands back so his palms would face Maria. And now she could see the true horror that was the fortune teller's hands. His palms did indeed have mouths that were found to be filled with needle-like teeth, feeling the deep gullet of the fortune teller's hands. And deep down its throat, Maria could see the fortune teller did have eyes within the mouths on his blood-soaked hands. "She doesn't howl. She screams," the mouths said in unison as the fortune teller rushed towards Maria hands first. "Oh," she said as she unslung her rifle as she fired 3 shots into the fortune teller's chest. Blood flowed from the holes, but she also noticed the fortune teller didn't flinch. He may very well be beyond pain at this point. "Ah, Tavit," she said as she dodged his lunge, firing another shot, this time at his head, where it clanged harmlessly off of the metal helm. So that tactic wasn't going to be usable. Where else could she fire that she might cause damage? The fortune teller held his hands out, palms forward as he examined the area, looking for Maria. "His eyes," Maria said, waiting for the fortune teller to notice her. Sure enough, he noticed her, and the eye in his hand focused on her. As Maria held the rifle up to her shoulder, she aimed and then fired, firing the bullet down the throat and into the eye. The fortune teller screamed for the first time when that happened. Maria, now confident, held the rifle up to her shoulder again, waiting for the fortune teller to attack her. Instead, it crouched down on all fours, hiding its hands and its eyes, as it backed away slowly, like a spider trying to escape an angry shoe. Maria fired again at his heart, which didn't slow him down, but it made her feel better. The fortune teller slid into the woods where it disappeared. Maria, satisfied with what she did, was now wondering, where are Michikotl and Sochi? Checking the clearing, she finally found where they were hiding. They were hiding behind a big berry bush, and she could see the broken twigs and their footprints. But she also saw that there was a trail leading away from the bush, looking like someone or something was dragging something heavy behind it. Someone or something dragged Michikotl and Sochi away. Either the fortune teller was a lot quicker than she thought, and he took them away while Maria was waiting for him, or, more ominously, the fortune teller wasn't alone, and someone disabled both Michikotl and Sochi and then dragged them away. Now Maria was all alone in trying to help her friends and in hunting the fortune teller. She turned away from the dragging trail and saw the fortune teller's trail. She could focus on the fortune teller and kill it right away, but her family was more important, and then they could take on the fortune teller together. Maria made her choice as she followed the drag marks to her unknown fate. Maria followed the drag tracks deeper into the forest. She was careful not to make any noise. Despite the fortune teller leaving the woods were still quiet. Something wasn't right here. If it wasn't the fortune teller that was causing the silence, then it was something else entirely. Likely the same thing that kidnapped Sochi and Michikoto. But what would have the ability to kidnap them both? Maria knew that her thoughts on that subject could be helpful or unhelpful, so she decided to focus on what she could see. The drag trail, without any obvious signs of a struggle, meant that the two of them were incapacitated before being taken, probably by chemical means, since force wouldn't work on Sochi, and psychic means wouldn't work for similar reasons. Somehow, as Maria followed the trail, it got even quieter. Her heartbeat, her steps, and even when she snapped her fingers next to her ears, all of it couldn't be heard at all. But sure enough, the trail led to a cliff face, and before the cliff was a large fire burning. Something burned in the fire that smelled like burnt pork, something Maria didn't want to identify. And tied to the cliff face was both Michikoto and Sochi. Both were chained in dark metal chains that resembled the bone steel used in Caligula's Carnival. The steel was made with the bones of those who lost them at the tables of the Carnival. Very durable, very esoteric. Maria was about to run over to them, but not before she saw the rest of the camp. Set by the fire and across from Michikoto and Sochi was a large, flat stone shaped almost like a table. On the table were bloody handprints and more of the fortune teller's corruption. It stank, and Maria could see that standing across from the camp, staring her down, was a very tall figure. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, and he was built like an old-fashioned Brewster from the 2600s. Large bare arms and a chest broad enough to push, or stop, a train. He wore a brightly colored outfit that was purple, and despite its weird color, it was cut like the Emperor's suit, minus the arms. But where the Emperor of the Seven Cities would only have a single splash of purple for his rank, this mockery would wear all purple. That was neat, despite all the blood and dirt in the wilderness. He was bald, but he wore a large double-pointed cap that was curved like horns, curved into the sky, with bells of bone on the points that jingled with his movements. But it was his face that was the most disturbing part of him. Like many others of his profession, he wore a mask made to mock mortal expression. It was almost like a harlequin mask, except harlequin masks didn't cover the entire face, with a mouth that had no teeth, and that moved with the unseen mouth underneath. Most harlequin masks also weren't bronze and bolted onto the face of the performer, with screws that leaked black blood that caused the ground to hiss and sizzle wherever it touched. And unique to this clown was also 2 bright red handprints on this mask's cheeks. Maria felt only a stab of panic in her heart when she saw his face, and the connection was made in her mind. The one who helped the fortune teller escape wasn't a guest. It was a clown. That's why the clown catcher didn't return. One of Caligula's enforcers, the stupidest clown in front of her, was tempted to change his fate, and now stood before her, knowing his future and with the power to change his own fate. "Well, took you long enough to arrive. Looks like you arrived." The clown checked his wrist that held no watch. "Just on time, so I'm sure you would prefer to just end it quickly. I will just tell you now, you cannot kill me, but you'll still try to prove me wrong," the clown said, just as Maria lifted her rifle to her shoulder, aiming it at the clown's chest. "See, what did I tell you? Well, let's make this easy," the clown said, removing from his jacket pocket a large paper target with a heart in the middle as he held it in front of his chest. "Shoot the heart, win a prize. Everyone's a winner," he said just as Maria squeezed the trigger. The gun kicked her in the shoulder, and the silence of the woods were met with a loud bang, while fire belched from the barrel. The target in the clown's hands tore right through the heart, and the clown dropped to his knees and grabbed at his chest. Oh no, what irony, what misfortune, that you were able to shoot me exactly like I said. But you broke fate, saying I cannot die by doing exactly what fate dictated you did. What a poetic prize for our heroine, the clown said as he curled up, groaning loudly and dramatically, before he laid back on his bent knees and threw his arms up, throwing a large explosion of confetti and glitter. He then stood up with ease, his suit not even messed up and no glitter or dirt on his suit. Oh, I guess you missed my heart. Well, maybe next time take me to dinner first if you want to catch my heart. I hear the best way to a man's heart is through his stomach, and I am quite hungry. After he finished his last line, his long snake-like tongue left his harlequin lips and licked his entire bronze face before slithering back into his mouth again. What are you? Maria asked him. The clown responded with a snap of his fingers as he disappeared into smoke, as 3 other clouds of smoke appeared around the camp. Maria glanced at the clouds, expecting him to appear from one of them. Instead, the smoke cleared and he didn't appear, at least until she heard him whisper behind her ear, almost making her jump, but she stood still and calm. My name is Chucklebuster, formerly chief enforcer of the plutocrats of Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage. Nowadays, I consider myself more freelance, Buster said as he stepped around Maria, his mask going from a smile to a dramatic sad face. So she didn't react the way he expected her to act. That would have to be noted. He's supposed to be able to see all of his futures, but maybe he couldn't see everything. Why didn't it work? Maria asked, which brought the smile back to the bronze face. Why? Do you want to try again? He asked, grabbing her rifle and pressing it against her temple. Maria was tempted to pull the trigger again, but she was smart enough to know that wouldn't work. But it would work as a different type of test. He was expecting her to try again, and she could just refuse to see if he did. To see if he did predict her actions, or just what he believes her actions to be. The contract with Caligula's Carnival states that judgment cannot take you until such time that your work with Caligula ends. Most clowns don't bother trying to stop damage because it cannot stop them. So, why did you bother to stop the bullet? Maria asked Buster, who tilted his head, but answered. Yes, he was someone who would rather explain himself than just kill her quickly. He probably spent centuries being told to maim, break, and kill without any reason, and without a single person asking him for his thoughts. Now he finally had an audience for his thoughts. Well, our contract also says we serve the carnival with all of our heart. When there's no more heart to serve the carnival, our contract is null, and the void comes to claim us. But the fortune teller has given me a brand new power. I just had to feed slapstick to him. Then the fortune teller showed me how I was able to escape without being missed. How I can finally change my face from just an enforcer to where I'm free. You showed me every version of my future and how to control them all, Buster said as he lifted his hands to the bloody handprints on his cheeks. You showed me how the other two were a threat to me, but you were nothing. There's no version of any future where you could even hurt me. You weren't worth knocking out with a smoke bomb. So I will keep living on and on and on. And the carnival will never be able to take me out, he said, spinning in place, as he pointed to where Michikotl and Sochi hung from the cliff face. The fortune teller crawled towards Sochi. One bleeding hand held a knife, while the other held the remaining eye that glanced towards them both. Maria held her rifle up and aimed at the fortune teller, while Buster sighed. You know that won't work, he said as Maria pulled the trigger again. This time confetti fired out of the rifle barrel. She wasn't sure what he did to change her SIR, but now her rifle wasn't going to help. She prepared to run towards her until she saw that the fortune teller was hanging his knife over Sochi's stomach. "You won't make it there in time," he said as Maria stood stock still, waiting for her opportunity. Buster was clearly expecting her to be frozen in fear, not realizing that she was just waiting for her opportunity. Maria stood there, letting the rifle barrel fall to the dirt, giving the impression to Buster that she was giving up. And sure enough, from the way his mask smiled and the way he moved, like he was a performer who made his audience laugh and he still hadn't let the punchline land. The fortune teller lifted his knife high over Sochi's stomach as he plunged it straight down. Sochi's shirt ripped, but there was a loud snap of metal as the knife shattered. The fortune teller lifted the broken blade, and Maria could see the fortune teller's remaining eye in his hand. She had one shot at this. Maria tossed her rifle towards Buster, who grabbed it without looking up. Perfect. That bought her a few seconds. She pulled her sidearm up from her side, an old-fashioned 8-shot revolver, one of her first weapons and one often missed when people searched her. She had plenty of practice at the range, and she was able to take out targets as far as 20 meters away. The fortune teller was at least 30 meters away, and the eye was much smaller than any bullseye she had ever seen. Plus, there were much larger targets of her cousin and his wife lying there. All she could do was trust her own training, and trust that any tiny variations in her hand, the wind, or even the fortune teller's abilities could all be compensated for as she pulled the trigger. There was an explosion of blood and 3 distinct screams as the fortune teller clutched his newly injured arm, while Buster clutched at the bloodstains on his mask. They were no longer red, and they were now starting to turn brown and flake away as the blood died. "What the hell? Why didn't I see it?" Buster asked while Maria aimed her revolver towards him. "The fortune teller has no ability to tell his own future. I figured you couldn't see what I was doing to him when you didn't intervene and save his first eye. You mentioned how you saw no version of the future where I was a threat to you? Let me try and change that for you," Maria said, firing her revolver where Buster stood, only to have him vanish into smoke before the bullet reached him. And already Maria could see 3 distinct smoke clouds form in front of her. Instead of focusing on those, she spun around, focusing behind her, where a new smoke cloud was forming. Aiming her revolver where his chest would be, she waited, and sure enough, Buster appeared, wielding a large axe, just as Maria pulled the trigger, sending a bullet through his chest. Buster fell to one knee, while black blood trickled out of his new wound in his chest. "Ow!" he croaked, while Maria held her revolver up to his temple. "You already pulled that trick once. Rabid dogs don't do new tricks," Maria said as she pulled the trigger again. This time, there was a loud thud as the axe fell to the ground, along with the purple suit. Chucklebuster was nowhere to be seen. No smoke was anywhere, and already Maria was trying to plot her new plan. If he's pulling a vanishing act, he isn't going to appear behind her again, especially since she called him out on predictability. His pride was going to push him to try something completely new now. Unfortunately, if clowns were good at anything, it was improvisation. Removing her spent round, she reloaded her 8-shot revolver as she made her way back towards Michikotl and Sochi. The fortune teller laid on the ground a few meters away, and judging by his lack of movement and the smell, he was well and truly dead. Maria crouched down and examined the locks. The chains, while being made of bone steel, the locks were cheap and likely just obtained from a gas station, so she could easily open it just by twisting it. But as Maria was stressing the lock, she felt the hairs on the back of her head stand up. She glanced out of the corner of her eyes without moving her head, and she could see Buster standing 50 meters away and holding a familiar weapon in his arms. Michikotl's crossbow aimed directly at her. Seeing him wield the crossbow, Maria knew that she was in deep danger with that weapon, but she also saw an opportunity. She would be playing a dangerous game, but it was a game she was very familiar with. Maria focused on the lock in front of her, twisting it, and sure enough, the lock popped off, so she moved on to the next lock, twisting it and stressing it, as she saw in the corner of her eye how uncomfortable Chucklebuster was getting. It wasn't enough for him to simply kill her. No, he wanted the big show, the spotlight on him for the entire time, the audience knowing well and truly who was doing the killing. He wouldn't settle for being a side act anymore. So, the longer she pretended not to see him, the more angry he got, the more likely he was to do something stupid. Maria saw as he aimed the crossbow and he squeezed the trigger, as Maria felt the air whoosh by her cheek and the crossbow bolt sprout out of the cliff face in front of her, as Buster dropped the crossbow and howled in pain. Maria turned to face Buster, who was clutching at a fresh wound on his chest as he tried to hold it together, unaware that he was also bleeding from his back, from the perfect hole that led from his chest to his heart and out through his back. You can't kill me. My contract with Caligula still stands. Judgment will never come for me, and Caligula can only torture me, Chucklebuster said in a wet whisper, as Maria removed something from her pocket. She was sure she had some, and fortunately she did. Maria removed 2 copper centi from her pocket, which brought a hiss from Buster, as Maria reminded him of another part of his contract. The Treaty of Copper states that no staff of Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage shall perform any service for any member of the Hunters Guild, and that was most certainly a performance that I am freely paying for. I hope that's enough for the ferryman, Maria said, dropping the 2 centi in front of him. As the coins dropped, so did the bronze mask, and for the first time in countless millennia, Chucklebuster's face was exposed to the world. Buster's skin on his face had long since rotted away. His eyes were bared to the world, unable to close, as endless tears fell into the dirt, while his fingers scrabbled through the dirt, looking for the centi. His mouth had long since dried out, and his tongue was gangrenous and rotten. Parts of his skull gleamed through his bloody flesh, which was grosser than an anatomy doll. Anatomy dolls didn't have individual muscle fibers that relaxed and tensed in front of your eyes, and they didn't leak blood and pus in front of you. As Chucklebuster finally grabbed the centi with his now red blood coating all the coins as his last breath escaped his lungs, Maria let out her own breath as she watched the rest of his black, corrupted blood turn red. She walked over to Michikotl and Sochi. This would require a lot of explanation, but she was confident they were going to get paid. The next day, Maria was in her home, while Michikotl and Sochi were recovering at their own home. They listened to her story about what happened, and Maria was now waiting for Pius to do his thing and mysteriously appear for his prize and the rest of her payment. Because him having a phone number for her to call would have been way too easy, and him appearing to help clean up the bodies would have been too much work for him, so Maria expected him at her home again. Unexpectedly, there was a knock. Maria looked through the people, and sure enough, it was Pius Poplicola. Maria could see that he had a big smile on his face, so odds are he was plotting another trick. But for now, he was doing what she asked, so she would play along. For now. Opening the door, she put her hand on her hip while she asked, "See, was that so hard?" "Yes, And yes, do you have what I asked for? Pius asked, getting to the point. Maria nodded and picked up the cooler filled with dry ice and the fortune teller's hands in a plastic bag. As we agreed, the fortune teller's hands, and as we agreed on, the rest of my payment. Maria said as she handed the cooler to the plutocrat, who peeked inside and nodded. It was what he wanted. And for your payment, he said, stepping aside and showing piles upon piles of gold coins outside. It covered all of Maria's lawn, and how her neighbors didn't notice, she didn't want to know. And already, Maria felt a sigh escape her lips. 200,000 auras. You're more than welcome to count them to verify, Pius said with an even larger smile as his joke finally landed. That's over 6 tons of gold, Maria said, while Pius smiled even wider. 6.25 tons, if you're using short tons. You do realize it would be easier to pay us by check, and if you pay us by cash, I'm going to need the form ID'd before Maria could finish. Pius removed a form from his pocket and handed it to Maria, while she looked it over. Sure enough, it was a valid form, giving the identifying information of Pius Poplicola, how much he paid, and how much his income was. All quite delicious information. Thank you, Mr. Poplicola. I'm sure the Revenue Service will be happy with this information come tax day, Maria said, holding the form, while Pius's smile immediately fell. What do you mean by that? Well, I pay taxes every year, like most people. If you paid us by check, the taxes would only apply to that account because that's all they could trace. But since you were nice enough to pay us with specie, the Revenue Service of the 7 cities will definitely be interested in your finances. But I'm sure everything is on the up and up with your taxes, so no chances of you being audited, Maria said, while Poplicola started sucking on his teeth, and he looked like he was sucking on a lemon. It's the Revenue Service. Soldiers, police, and even Metaman himself couldn't find us. Why would you think they would do any better? If you think you're untouchable, I'm sure you know better than me, Maria said with a shrug, which only brought down Poplicola's expression even more. Many who thought they were untouchable. Crime lord, celebrity, old money, cult leader, supervillains, and even members of the imperial family thought they couldn't be touched by anyone. But the Revenue Service was able to catch them and arrest them when no one else was able to. And Maria was willing to bet every single coin on her lawn that all of the plutocrats kept money outside of the Carnival also. And this was the empire of the 7 cities. Thieves were required to report stolen property and pay taxes on them. The Revenue Service wouldn't care about how supernatural Caligula's Carnival was. If there was money that they owed but didn't pay, they would pursue them through Pandemonium and LCL to get every coin earned. Pius grabbed the form from Maria and put it back in his pocket while he took out his checkbook and wrote it out for 200,000 auras. Fine. I have decided this would be easier for everyone involved for me to just write out a check, he said as he tore off the check and handed it to Maria. In the memo, he wrote, I hate you. Thank you, plutocrat. Is there anything else I can help you with? She asked while Pius sighed. You'll get consequences for your arrogance someday, Pius said, about to turn away, but not before she called out after him. No, I won't. I am your consequence. A reminder that you can't bully and bulldoze everything to go your way. Stay humble and treat the hunters as your equals. Do remember, it was Caligula who reached out to us for help, not the other way around, Maria called out as he walked away. The coins on her lawn vanished, but most of the grass was now dead. She sighed as she closed the door and got ready to deposit her check via her phone. This was a rough mission, but ultimately it worked out. Her hands were clean from the blood of the innocent, and everyone got out without any permanent harm. And they all got paid very well, which would help fund many more hunts. Maria smiled as the check was deposited and cleared, and now it would be time for her to figure out what to do for dinner. After Pius Poplicola left the home of M Tun, it was a small matter of finding a path back to Caligula's Carnival. A turn off a side street that was not quite there, and a few steps between a painting of two clowns, one smiling and one frowning. Between joy and melancholy is where the plutocrat walked to his home. When Pius made it through the path, he appeared at the entrance of the carnival. Here the red tents and bright lights could be seen for miles, but the darkness around the carnival was one that even the plutocrat dared not to stare too long into. Here the abyss didn't merely gaze back, it struck first. Making his way to the entrance, Pius saw that the ostiary was taking tickets from the line that never seemed to end. The guests never noticed where the tickets came from. They just knew it was in their hands when they arrived at the entrance. They weren't observant enough to notice how every ticket was blood-soaked and had to be cut from their hands. But Pius Poplicola could see every scrap of flesh that the ostiary collected, bringing even more into the carnival. As Pius passed by the line, the guests' eyes turned misty, as they were unable to even remember seeing Pius while he was in this place. But the ostiary, with his bloodshot eyes and his fingertips worn to a sharp point, paused from his duty to bow his head towards the plutocrat as he passed. Pius didn't bother to acknowledge him. He knew the ostiary's name, but if he gave it, then he would end the ostiary's contract and his life. So Pius did the merciful thing and refused to acknowledge him as he traveled into the carnival proper. The carnival smelled like any other carnival out in the world. The smell of animals, cooking food, machine grease, people, and sewage all intermingled in the air. That brought a large smile to Pius's face as he stepped over a man lying face down in his own blood. As Pius walked by, he reached into his pocket and threw loose gold coins among the masses of the carnival. People would pause in their games and bets to scrabble for the gold coins, like rats after scraps of food. Pius only laughed to himself as he watched both guests and workers alike fight and scrounge for the coins. When the coins left Pius's hands, they were clean and pure. By the time they made it to the hands of the masses, they were covered in filth, dirt, and blood, as they fought to hold on to even a single coin, as Pius threw another handful of coins, creating another mad rush for the gold, as he took a deep breath. That was the smell of home, the glorious smell of blood, sewage, disease, and pain. That smell meant that from this filthy sewer, pure gold flows. As Pius made his way deeper into the carnival, past all of the circles into where even the employees would fear to tread, Pius had one job to do before he went to see his boss. In a dark, secluded tent, a woman sat chained to the table, her arms tied down and fully exposed. She approached Pius asking about her son a few days ago, but now she was exhausted and unable to speak due to the metal plates over her eyes and mouth. The screws dripped crimson as she still bled, and despite clearly being in pain, she had grown too tired to try to escape anymore. Pius lifted the cooler up and opened it. Removing some familiar hands from the cooler, he whispered to the hands while he laid them down. He waited while the cold, pale hands twitched as the fingers dragged the hands over to where the woman's hands laid, while the fortune-teller's teeth dug into the flesh while she screamed behind her metal plate. After a few minutes, the woman's hands were left as bloody bones, as Pius removed a blade from his suit and cut away the bony remains from the woman's wrists, while the woman's tears and blood dripped from her eye plates, while the plutocrat connected the severed hands to the woman's wrists. The woman kept crying and screaming while the tendons were tied and as the skin was sewn together. The hands twisted as the palms faced upwards, as the mouths opened, and the needle-like teeth surrounded green eyes, the same color as the woman's eyes. "Welcome back, fortune teller," Pius said as the two hands began to scream, as the fortune teller realized he was trapped by the carnival once again. When Pius was done, he left the fortune teller to his new body, as Pius traveled even further into the carnival, deep within the carnival, to a place that only the plutocrats, and once a witch, ever went. Pius prepared to meet the master of the carnival. The door to the master's room didn't have any doorknob, but Pius was able to enter anyway. While within the room, the lights were dim, while Pius crawled towards where his master sat. In the dim light of the single torch, Pius's clothes were very different. His fine suit was now dirty, blood-stained rags. His hat was replaced by a simple crown of gold as he crawled towards his master's throne. His hands stuck to the drying blood on the floor, and he only stopped when he reached the step, careful not to look upon his master as he kept his eyes down to his bony, blood-stained hands. "The fortune teller has been recaptured, my master." Pius's words echoed through the room before fading to silence. Then he spoke again. "What do you want me to do next to serve you?" Pius asked. There was no response as Pius waited and waited. After 20 minutes of silence, Pius bowed his head to the ground, smearing blood on his forehead before he spoke again. "I understand, my lord," he said as he turned to crawl away, again careful not to look up and to not look upon his master. But he also moved as quietly as possible as he moved his way to the door. While Pius did not know of anyone who had angered the master, he had heard that the master's anger was legendary. So he hoped the quiet would please his master. As he left the room to go to his other duties, the master's room sat quiet. Within the master's room, in the center full of the room full of blood and darkness, was a single throne, carved out of gold with gems embedded throughout, so even in the dim light, the gems reflected the light and made the throne appear bright as the sun. But as for who was sitting on the throne of the master of Caligula's Carnival of Cannibalistic Carnage, the throne was empty. The master was nowhere to be seen, and he was nowhere within the throne room. The throne was empty, like it always was.